entitled this chapter, Chapter 8, Form Follows Function, or does it? Kind of like a question. I would just like to give a few introductory remarks. This is a complex subject. With the discovery of the DNA molecule, many people assume that a lot of this has been solved, but it has not. It has been shown by Aaron Saxton Burr in 1972 in his publications, a Yale professor, that there's not enough information in the DNA molecule to explain form. This is a fascinating subject. Dr. David Bohm, a Princeton University professor of physics and a protege of Albert Einstein, began to experiment with morphic field theories. Morphic is the Greek word, of course, for form. Morphic field theory, saying that there had to be, or there probably were, magnetic fields around all kinds of forms that actually were learning fields, that actually could learn and dictate and adapt to environmental conditions. And he did experiments, let's say, with crystals. And he would form brand new crystals that never existed before, and he would time them on very sophisticated clocks. And every time the crystals would form, they would form faster, as if they were learning how to do it. And so it's an exciting field about form. What is form? Anyways, we talked about in the first part of our presentation, we talked about the areas of abstract metaphysics, of consciousness being the foundation of all things, coming all the way down to the physical bodies. We also talked about, in the last chapter, the different models of anatomy, the energy systems of the Chinese with the meridians, the acupuncture meridians that are inside the body, and also the model of the Indian model of the spinal chakras, which means spinning wheels of energy, and also Dr. Smith's way of looking at energy going through the bones. And you put this all together, you get a nice integrated package of energy coming from the divine self, from the solar system, from the universe, in through the bones. It's called chi or prana in different Eastern and Middle Eastern, India and China will say. This in ki in actually Japan, but this energy comes in, we need it, it's a part of the energy life force we need, just like the calories are in the food that we eat. The fresher the food, the better the food, because also the etheric energy or the life force is still in the food. This is why fresh food is always better. Anyway, the point is that we wanted to talk about that. We also talked about in the last chapter how the fascia, which is a connective tissue in the body, actually is very important in how not only does it bind the system together, but it's the interface from our perspective between the etheric body, which is the lowest energy body that we can sense, to our physical body, and the interface between them is the fascia system, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. Okay? Now, moving on. Here's a few quotes. Form follows function, or does it? Every change in the form and the function of a bone, or in its function alone, is followed by a certain definite changes in the internal architecture and secondary alterations in its external conformation. Form follows function by Julius Swift, The Law of Bone Transformation is the title of his writing. Now, another way of saying it is, to every action there is always an opposed equal reaction, or to the mutual action of two bodies upon each other, are always and directed to contrary parts. In other words, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, which we always relate to Einstein, but it was originally said by Sir Isaac Newton in his Principia Mathematica in 1687. Now, the above quotations by Newton and Wolff are statements of the physics that all people experience in the common sense everyday world of living. Because of them, we can predict with pretty good accuracy the telemetry of a bullet, a rocket ship, or the orbit of any planet within our solar system. And this is true. This is what we call Newtonian physics. In other words, in the everyday physical world, the big chunks of matter and things seem to conform to these Newtonian laws of gravity and different things. Force equals mass times acceleration, those types of formulas all work well. But when we get into the subatomic world, all these fall apart, which many physicists have talked about, and there's great productions on this that you can research yourself. But basically at the very quantum physics world, this all just goes away. And particles don't behave that way at all. And a whole new law takes over, implying consciousness actually controls the formation of the molecules, are the form, see, and the molecules or atoms finally control the cells, and the cells the shapes of the bodies, are the different forms that are in the world, whether it be mineral, plant, or animal. There's a consciousness behind it. Now, this leads to a conflict that's going on between people today in the medical field. You'd say the alternative healers versus the mainstream Western allopathic. Western allopathic mainstream is still pretty much locked into Newtonian physics, but they're slowly changing with some of their machines, and they're allowing more alternative medicines to come in, either because they know there's money in it, or because actually a few people like Dr. Robert Oz actually see benefits to it and sees that there's something there. Now, many contemporary therapists, I call this Einstein versus Newton, argue that the paradigm of Newtonian physics is adequate for diagnosing and treating maladies of the human body. Okay, they argue that while the biomechanical model is a necessary component, it is not enough. Physics has changed immensely in the last 300 years due to individuals like Albert Einstein and people who came after him. So there's a lot of contemporary therapists who argue that the paradigm of Newtonian physics is completely inadequate. This is what I've been saying. Even in the biomechanical fields of physical therapy and stuff, a lot of new thinking's coming about. Thomas Myers, in his book entitled Anatomy Trains, is actually challenging the compression theory of, let's say, the spinal cord or any of the bones in the body, saying that it isn't really, the spine is not compressing on itself, that it's actually, when it's functioning correctly, it's actually suspended like little suspension ropes in space. And this is called like a suspension bridge. It's called the tensegrity model. When everything's functioning, the whole spinal cord and body is actually suspended, and you might say in a type of fascia. We're going to come back to fascia and talk about it more and more. Now, they use the word tensegrity. Now, tensegrity versus compression. One way of expressing this paradigm for seeing body structure as a suspension model rather than compression comes from the field of architecture. Buckminster Fuller, the great architect, created the geodesic dome structure and coined the term tensegrity for the engineering principle suspending it in space. And this is what we see happening. We see people arguing this point now, that there is actually some kind of tensegrity model happening. Excuse me. Now, this leads to the question, what is finally fascia itself? You know, fascia is a connective tissue that runs throughout the whole body. It holds us together. It's in our bones, it's in our cells. It goes all the way from the what they call the cytoskeletal structure within a cell, very tiny, all the way to the membrane that surrounds the cell and glues it to another cell, all the way to all the cells being wrapped together in an organ or in a muscle or a tendon, and then that whole muscle being wrapped in fascia, and finally the whole arm, let's say our bicep, is wrapped in fascia. And then finally these fascia patterns, which Thomas Myers discovered, called anatomy trains, run exactly parallel to the same patterns that are in the Chinese meridian systems. And some of the more middle-aged documents that have been discovered imply that the fascia has been described as a gritty tissue. I mean, the meridian systems has been described as a gritty tissue, much like fascia. So what we're seeing now is this connection where the fascia is coming together. Now the fascia has a three-tier system to it. It has what you would say a elastin layer, which if you were to put pressure lightly on a joint or something or on the tissues, within about 30 seconds they would start to smooth out and stretch a little bit. And then if you hold it for 3 minutes, then it begins to liquefy, which is this base material. It's a polysaccharide liquid, begins to liquefy, and then as that hydrates and liquefies, then all of a sudden the actual connective tissue itself, which is all wrapped up like this, begins to slowly loosen, and after about 5 minutes the whole system becomes fluid, and this is where it becomes a living matrix, which we'll get into in a minute. But at that point, let's suffice it to say that when the fascia begins to loosen in one area, it begins to loosen all over, and if you loosen it in the whole body simultaneously, the whole body becomes, through the fascia system, one complete living matrix that communicates with itself simultaneously. Thought you might find it interesting. Now, fascia is everywhere, like I said. It's in your bones, it's in the cells, it's around the bones, it's around everything, every layer. Now, if I took some saran wrap and wrapped it around my arms, I wouldn't be able to move my arms. And it wouldn't take much saran wrap to do it, because fascia has a tensile strength of 2,000 pounds per square inch. It's very strong. But if I began to use a hair dryer on it, it would slowly loosen, and before you know it, it would start to stretch apart. Okay, because it liquefies. And this is the point where we're talking about the fascia becoming a living matrix. I've shown some pictures of fascia to you in my PowerPoint here, and you can see it's around muscles and everything, and I have a picture of the anatomy trains also, just in the back alone, that shows the way the fascia runs over the way the muscles are put together in the posterior part of the body. Now, what I was just showing you here, where you put constant pressure but very lightly, 5 ounces of pressure is all it takes to really cause the fascia to begin to loosen and unwrap, is a technique taken from myofascial release. Here a therapist applies a gentle traction to the myofascial system of the shoulder, arm, and wrist complex in the presentation I'm showing here. And in myofascial release, no more than 5 ounces to a few pounds traction is needed to cause the myofascial fibers and ground substance to hydrate, stretch, and release. There is also an exchange of electromagnetic energy involved with the process. Yes, there's something called piezoelectricity. It's Greek to press. With piezoelectricity, you can actually create electricity out of just force. You can actually transform force into electricity. You see that in the kids' shoes that they have today, those little tennis shoes that light up as they walk. That's piezoelectricity. The force actually causes the electrons within the actual crystal. If you take a crystal and you pound on it, the force in the crystal actually causes the electrons to align, especially when it's along its vortex, causes it to align and emit an electric charge. And this is what you see when these kids are walking with their shoes. Very cute little shoes that make these funny little lights go off and on. Now, what's interesting is that the body itself, the fascia system, is equivalent to a liquid crystal. So it is totally capable of sending induction and conduction various ways through the body, especially when it's hydrated. So drink plenty of water. It is good for you. Therefore, the fascia connection is a living matrix. The fascia system, taken as a whole, is another more ancient nervous system that can act as a living unit independent of the central and peripheral nervous system. This is true. It can bypass the brain. So there have been experiments done with the fascia system by Dr. John Oshman. He's documented it with his professor. He went to Woods Hole Marine Biology Institute and in New England area, and they've documented that the fascia itself is capable of doing this. They've documented situations where people have actually had reactions that are faster than the nervous system can actually function. And the only other explanation is that the fascia system is working. This is what Christopher Reeves was working with, the actor, before he passed away of an infection, unfortunately, a great man, was working with trying to actually get the fascia system to move the body again, to the fascia system to reconnect the electrical circuits, because they were broken, of course, in the spinal cord from his neck injury. But nonetheless, he was making some progress, and there's a lot of experiments going on in this area now. Now, what I wanted to finally talk about a little bit here was, again, getting back to form and function. How does the etheric body work with this? Now, the 4 lower bodies is what we're mainly concerned with as human beings. The mental body, which holds our concrete and abstract thoughts. Our emotional body, which is our astral body, holds our desires, feelings, and then finally our etheric body, which helps to do a lot with the processes in the body and at the same time interfaces with the fascia to the physical body and helps control form. Okay? Now, there was an experiment done by Smith Dr. Smith, and it's a fascinating experiment. And you can look in my book to get all the details and the footnotes and where to look for all this stuff. But Smith's experiment was that he said, if this is true, if what Aaron Burr says is true and all these other scientists say is true, that there's not enough information in the DNA molecule, that there's a form field that's forming shape, I should be able to prove this in some kind of experiment. So he took salamander. Salamanders can, as you know, can recapitulate. Certain reptiles can recapitulate their limbs. And he photographed them, and he actually got pictures of them with their, you might call it their energy field. You can feel the energy field around you. It's very physical. It's there. You can feel heat from your hands. He photographed it with special photography and lenses, and he's seen an outline around it, just like 5 fingers would have an outline of energy around it. Then he clipped off the tail, like clipping off my tongue, and re-photographed it, and he found the energy was still out there, like it didn't disappear with the limb, and of course the limb grew back out. Now, he took a frog, and the frog cannot recapitulate its limbs. He took a photograph of it. There was energy around all 4 limbs, and then of course he cut one off, and then but the energy was not there now, implying that if there's something to this energy biomagnetic field theory, that perhaps if he could artificially, synthetically reproduce this, he could actually regrow the limbs in a frog. Well, believe it or not, it took him 2 years to get a battery small enough to fit inside there, but once he put that battery in there, he was able to recapitulate and regrow the limbs many times. And it wasn't just reptiles, he also did this experiment with rabbits. So there's a lot of strong implications here in the scientific world that perhaps that form does follow function, but it also follows consciousness. And biomagnetic fields and energy is information. Thank you very much.